Welcome to week 9, everyone. Want to spend a few minutes here orienting you to this week by talking about the transition from your interpretive working papers to your advanced interpretive papers on the same passage that you studied for your interpretive working paper, and then also devote a little bit of time to kind of setting the stage for our study of this final extended discourse of Jesus in Matthew, what's often called the Olivet Discourse because of the location where the narrative presents Jesus offering these words of response to his disciples' question on the Mount of Olives. First of all, though, let me mention that several of us have talked about the possibility of getting together, those of you who are coming to Pasadena for graduation. And I do think we're going to be able to gather at my house, and we are hoping to be able to do that on June 14th. So that'll be the Friday evening before the commencement ceremony. I'll send further details once I'm able to confirm them, but mark your calendars if you're going to be in town, whether you're graduating or not. And maybe for those who aren't graduating or going to be in town, we'll figure out a way to do a sort of video conference greeting or something like that so that we can be as connected as possible there at the very end of the class. Maybe I should also say before talking about the transition to the advanced interpretive papers that as a class, you did really excellent work on the interpretive working paper. I was just really impressed with the analysis, the kind of narrative sensibility that I see sort of broadly well expressed across the class. So great work. I think it's giving me a lot of confidence about where we're going with this advanced interpretive paper. Your task is basically to take that initial investigative probe that you have done of your passage and all the questions that you've asked and sort of teased out possible interpretations in response to those questions, and to turn that analysis now into one sustained and coherent interpretation of the passage as a whole. That means that there should be in your paper a single sustained argument that substantiates and defends your interpretation of the passage. When I say your interpretation of the passage, I mean that you will offer your sense of the whole in a kind of thesis early in the paper, and then you will devote your paper to, as I say, sort of unpacking that thesis and defending the various component parts of it by the way that you present the passage in your paper. What this implies is that all of the parts of your passage fit together, that they're part of a whole, a textual unit. And of course, that whole or textual unit is itself part of the kind of larger arc of the narrative of Matthew and the particular development of the section of the narrative in which your passage appears. And so what you want to do is to clearly sort of situate your passage in the flow of the narrative, and just a bit of feedback kind of generally to the class in the way that you sort of paint the picture for how your passage fits into the segment of the narrative. You want to be articulating how it is that that narrative situation clarifies what your passage is about and even what particular parts of it mean. So you don't want to just talk about the context in the narrative sort of broadly without any reference to your passage, to the parts of your passage, to particular details in your passage. Instead, you want to be showing, as you're setting the stage, how the stage that you're setting is important for your interpretation of the passage. That will give your situation of the passage in the flow of the narrative kind of traction for your interpretation of the passage itself. And then as you are attending to the details of the passage, sort of even the intricacies of it, you want to be thinking about those details, that development internally in terms of like chunks or parts. Watch out for that tendency that is so common in our time because of a variety of reasons, but especially I think the kind of commentary tradition, to treat certain parts of the passage as sort of relatively independent sort of fragments, as it were, where you could interpret a sentence or a key word apart from how it fits into the sort of paragraph that it's a part of in the passage as a whole, and how that passage as a whole fits into the flow of the narrative. You always want to be thinking about how to make sense of particularly difficult details or transitions in your passage in terms of how they are part of sort of chunks of text in the passage, rather than thinking of them only in terms of an isolated phrase or a sentence or certainly a word. To this end, it will be helpful to divide your advanced interpretive paper into headings. Some of you pointed out that my sample papers for the interpretive working paper didn't include the headings that I encourage you to use, and I'm sorry for that. I'm hoping that from this class I'll have some new samples that will have headings for future classes. But the same goes for this advanced interpretive paper by dividing the development of your interpretation and the passage itself into stages in which you're going to carry out the interpretation. You encourage your own kind of presentation of the passage to be dealing with the parts as chunks that are themselves part of a whole, as opposed to trying to interpret fragments as if they were independent, or as if they had some kind of stable meaning apart from how they fit into the flow of the passage. So do try to use headings to stage the development of your interpretation, which you will have sort of presented in summary form at the beginning of the paper so that it's transparent how the sections with headings of your paper are developing that interpretation that you have presented in summary form at the beginning of your paper. Hopefully that gives you some guidance for the advanced interpretive paper. Let's move with the remaining minutes here to kind of setting the stage for our study of this final discourse of Jesus's in Matthew, the fifth major discourse of the gospel narrative. Just to signal here up front that my interpretation of this passage, which you'll be hearing in the podcast exposition, is not conventional. It's not without precedent in the Christian tradition, at least in certain respects, but it is unusual, especially in the kind of commentary tradition that is so influential in the recent past, and especially in evangelical circles. I basically take the passage to be, first of all, Jesus's answer to the question that his disciples have put to him, and an answer that never varies from addressing that question, even though interpretations often seem to forget that the whole discourse is in answer to that question of his disciples, which of course itself is in response to a terrifying prophecy that Jesus has uttered. And that consequently I take the passage to be fundamentally about the fall of the temple and all that that implies, with a kind of catastrophic unraveling of the life of the Jewish community in the land. And this, of course, culminates in the fall of the house of God in the town of Jerusalem. Just to maybe anticipate some of my main reasons for parting ways with some of the most predominant interpretations. First of all, it's crucial, I think, to interpret this passage, as I've said, not only in light of how it is presented in the narrative as a response to the question of Jesus' three closest disciples, but also how the discourse and its subject matter fits the arc of the narrative, the sort of large sweep of the narrative in which Jesus has not been preparing his disciples for what we might think of as the absolute end of human history, the absolute end of the world, but instead a change in regime that involves the coming of kingdom from heaven, the kingdom of God, as Jesus describes it a few times, but it's a kingdom from heaven that is coming in and through him to the earth. And as they have been approaching Jerusalem, he has been telling them that decisive in this coming to power of himself as king, and thus embodying and spreading this kingdom from heaven, is, ironically, Jesus' own fall, his death, by being handed over to authorities in Jerusalem, eventually to their Gentile overlords, and being crucified, and nevertheless raised from among the dead. This is what he's been preparing them for, and this is part, as this discourse tells us, of a large upheaval in the land that will take place within Jesus' own generation. So that's what I take the arc of the narrative to have sort of framed for us, and I think the subject matter of the discourse must take that arc of the narrative into account. This goes as well for the so-called coming of the Son of Man, which immediately sends many of our minds to something like the doctrine of the second coming and the imaginary that we have of that. That's a doctrine, just so you all know, that I affirm, that I believe. I just don't think that Matthew 24 to 25 is directly about that ultimate coming of Jesus, but instead is about his coming to power through his fall and rise, which culminates then in the fall of Jerusalem and the rise of Jesus to power and the spread of his name in and through that catastrophic fall of the house of God. So that is kind of where things are going. Maybe one other piece to keep in mind is that I think, as many of you probably observed with what I said about Jesus calling the temple a den of robbers following Jeremiah and Jeremiah 7, that the Old Testament context is crucial for interpreting this discourse. Jesus will talk about stars falling from the sky, but he's not talking about something you see in a telescope. He's talking about Isaiah 13, which is about the fall of Babylon, primarily, as a sort of shining light of power in the world that shaped so many people's lives and then fell cataclysmically. So the Old Testament background is important here. I've added the Josephus reading because I think that it helps you get a sense of how catastrophic and formative these events were, and maybe a little bit more than a museum-like memory of it. And I hope that will lead us to have some discussion about how Christians should imagine the future in the wake of these events.